Peace, love, and light. It is Coach Twilight, the self-love and self-care advocate. Today we are going to talk about something that I found very, very interesting. We're going to talk about the relationship that feminism, white supremacy, LGBTQ, and what they all have in common. Now, why are we having this conversation in the first place? Well, first, I want to make the disclaimer that I personally do not have anything against anyone's particular viewpoints. But often, we take on these viewpoints, these patinas and personas without having historical data and knowledge about what has created these things that we generally subscribe to because we are triggered emotionally. So this is going to be the difference between being a person who makes a decision in awareness and a person who makes a decision off of reacting from a particular circumstance. We need to know the origins of the reason why we make the choices that we make. Otherwise, we are simply going to be churning in and out of a machine called social engineering. And if you're not careful, you could be washed on shore through the process of social engineering and being mentally programmed by what you see around you. So I ask that you keep an open mind. This is going to encompass historical accounts as well as metaphysical accounts, as well as philosophy and my own conclusions that I've drawn through connecting the dots of the information that I'm going to provide today. So, what is the connection here between patriarchy, feminism, LGBTQ, and parentheses with the potential for the P, which we're going to get into later, and white supremacy? Well, I have to take you all the way back to a distinct time frame where these cultural identities may have originally surfaced. Now, it's important to note that in metaphysics, with spiritualists, we'll say something to the extent of energy never dies, it's only transferred. Now, this is an important thing to note because what we're going to be talking about is the energy of culture, the energy of rules, mentalities, and things that were set in place decades and centuries ago, and how that particular mentality has morphed into today's society unbeknownst to us. See, many times we think that we are coming across some new age ideas, but these ideas are not new. They have just taken on a new form. And so ultimately, because we don't know enough about historical context and culture, we can't make the connection that it originally came from somewhere. Now, it is said that on various different accounts that the Roman Empire began somewhere around 146 BC. Some accounts say, it began in 753 BC and ruled into 1453 AD. There was some time frames in between that it was not prominent, but it was still very much so influential in the Eastern society. Now, I want to say that I am not a historian. Most of these accounts have come from research that I've done, and obviously, as you know, when it comes to research, it is generally something where you have to find various different sources in order to fully make a connection between things that are repetitive. But as we know, history is always told from the perspective of the conqueror and not the conquered. So we can only assume that this information is accurate. With that said, prior to Rome actually ruling during those times, you must note that it was a different mentality than what we are used to today. Religion was heavily influenced in the ancient times. We don't see that type of influence today, or do we? But prior to Rome's ruling, Greece was in power. And it appears that they ruled till about 800 BC, as some accounts say. Now, there was a particular war that occurred that caused the Roman Empire to kind of rise to prominence, and it was called the Fourth Macedonian War around 150 BC to 146 BC, and it was saying that like Rome's military was simply kicking ass and taking names. They were powerful, they were brutal, and they pretty much subdued Greece around that time. Now, here is something to know. Whenever an empire takes over another empire, what tends to happen is it becomes an eclectic mix for the next empire that takes over. What do I mean by that? What I mean is they begin to take the best of what is working for that empire, and they utilize that to structure their now new conquered territory. So for example, they may take some aspects of the culture, they may take some aspects of the art, they may take some aspects of the military, they may take some aspects of the government. So Rome took on a lot of the cultural identity of Greece. It was almost like they took the best of what Greece had to offer them. Now, this is also important to note that Greece and both Rome parallel in a lot of ways from a structural standpoint ancient Egypt. Now, if you do any kind of studying, it is real easy to see that our Western society has taken on a lot of the cultural identity of Rome. With the creation of law, the development of the way that the government is, we're looking at even the whole democracy, quote, based system came from Rome. And in Rome, it was said that they created this kind of 3 branches to the government so that they can stop anyone from abusing their power. Quote, the U.S. Senate is highly based on Roman ideas. We could look at the architecture, we could look at the art, we could look at various different things that we just pretty much culture vultured from Rome. We hijacked from Rome. Or did we really hijack it? Is Rome still running things over here? So we took their government structure, we took their art, we took the way that they run their judicial system, we took the literature, even the city planning, the infrastructure, and that's all we took. Remember I said earlier how they would take an eclectic mix of the culture. So when Rome took over and conquered Greece, they took ideas from Greece. When Greece took over ancient Kemet, they took ideas from there as well. It was all a transference of tangible art, literature, ideas, but it was the energy that was also transferred as well. That's going to be important to note later. So we have to understand that the influence of Rome is heavy here in the Western society. And because the influence is so heavy here, we have to understand why we may think, act, behave a certain way. And it all may be just a part of the energy of the culture of the ruling dynamic.
Sex is one of the things that's always absolutely enticed us about the Roman Empire. The story of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who used to go off to his villa in Capri, where he had a great swimming pool, and he had specially trained little boys who swam underwater while the emperor was swimming and nibbled his genitals. And he had specially trained little boys who swam underwater while the emperor was swimming and nibbled his genitals.
No, God! No, God, please, no!
And it wasn't just the emperors. There's a very famous Roman empress, Messalina, who was the wife of the slightly doddery old emperor Claudius. And she is supposed to have challenged the prostitutes of Rome to a competition to see how many men they could sleep with in a single night. And of course, Messalina beat all the prostitutes.
I'd like to bring attention to a book by, well, I would say this is a scholarly anthology by a man named Kevin Cohen. And in this particular book, which is called A History of Virility, it's a 700-page book that goes over the virility or the masculine identity of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Now, see, the reason why this is important is because, once again, the masculine identity of Western society is heavily influenced by these particular ancient societies, even till today. And I'm going to get into why just a little bit later. Now, virility is a word that we don't commonly use today. It was an adjective that was used to describe a specific type of man. I'm going to give you a description of this man and you tell me what this sounds like. Okay, so the man had to be tall in stature, muscular. He had to be one of sound mind, intelligence. He had to have a certain level of sexual vibrato, but he wasn't a hoe. He didn't sleep around a whole lot because in that time that could have been seen as effeminate. Think of Russell Crowe in the movie Gladiator. He had that steely resolve, you know, very, very beguiling to women. That is an important part of the masculine identity definition of virility in Rome. This type type of man is constantly put out to us as being the predicator of what it means to be masculine. And I can't lie, even as a woman, you look at some man like that and you just go, whoo. And what do we call that in our society? Alpha male. We call those type of men who carry that an alpha male, right? But we have to understand that these words, as well as these cultural things, take shape and they turn into something else as time goes on. So while virility at that time was used to depict a certain type of male, now virility, instead of becoming an adjective, has now become a personification. Now we call that the alpha male. See how that has morphed? Now we're talking about the time frame of Rome and Greek. We're talking about a mainly patriarchal society. As history states, there was no definition of homosexuality in Roman society. There was a structural element to the way that people chose to have sex, and it was very hierarchical. What we saw was men who engaged in same-sex relationships either had sex with a slave, an entertainer, or a prostitute. Yes, there were male prostitutes very prominent at that time. Let's keep that in mind. So they were able to take on a partner who was a slave, a prostitute, or an entertainer. You would also see that males who were of wealth and prominence were able to take on young boys, stayed under the guise of the word pederasty, P-E-D-E-R-A-S-T-Y. This is what was considered man-boy love. Ultimately, if you make the connection, you can see that this is where the little guy Cupid comes from, that you see being advertised on your TV screen every Valentine's Day. Yeah, that guy. That's where he comes from. That's his origin. So these particular same-sex relationships had a hierarchical fashion to them. If the male that was penetrating, he was not considered the guy that was tainted. See, there was no word for homosexuality. So therefore, the man that was dominating was considered still to be virile.